today's movie review, it's a rather special review on my behalf because as of this review, it's my over 100th episode. That's a big milestone for me. And I'm not going to lie, I'm having a bit of a surreal moment because back in 2013 when I started doing these movie reviews, I didn't think I was going to make it this far. Because back when I did my review of Captain America Civil War, that was my 50th review, and it took 3 to 4 years to reach 50 reviews. Yeah, as of this review, it took just a little over a year to reach 100 episodes. Weird. But anywho, what I'm trying to say is, it took me a while to reach 100 episodes. And since this is my 100th episode, I had to really think about what movie I really want to choose to do a review of, and I decided to go with Gojira, along with its Americanized counterpart, Godzilla King of Monsters. And why did I choose this particular set of films to review for my 100th episode? It's simple. I'm a big fan of the Godzilla franchise. Like, if I had to make a top 10 list of favorite movie franchises, the Godzilla movie series would be number 1 on that list. Hell, my channel name is named after a Godzilla monster, albeit an obscure Godzilla monster, but you get the point. Also, I didn't really know what to do for a 100th episode, since there's so many movies I could have done a review of. And now that I'm telling everyone that I'm a huge Godzilla fan, I bet you're wondering, why didn't you review the other films in the franchise back when the 2014 movie came out? Well, back in 2014 when the Godzilla movie was coming out, it was Godzilla's 60th anniversary, and a shit ton of Godzilla-themed YouTubers were reviewing every single Godzilla movie in preparation for that movie. And at that particular point in time, I was just like, why bother reviewing all the Godzilla movies when A, everyone else is reviewing them at this current moment, B, I could just watch something like James Rolfe's Godzilla-thon from 2008, or watch the few Godzilla reviews that Brian Tindall does on his channel. But as time went on, I was like, fuck it, might as well. And so, here we are. Also, if you've been paying attention to my videos for some time, I didn't plan on reviewing all 30 plus Godzilla movies. However, there is a way I plan on going about these reviews. I'm going to start by reviewing 5 to 6 Godzilla films at a time, then review 5 to 6 non-Godzilla movies in between, then repeat the process. That way I, and the people watching these reviews, don't get Godzilla fatigue. So, before we begin the review itself, what is Godzilla exactly, and how did his creation come about? Well, for those of you who don't know what Godzilla is, which is like, what, 2 of you? Godzilla is a giant radioactive dinosaur that has appeared in 30 plus movies, who has become a pop culture icon on par with famous fictional characters from Mickey Mouse, Superman, Batman to James Bond. And as Brian Tindall said on his top 10 favorite Godzilla movies, Godzilla has been everything from an allegory of nuclear weaponry to being the savior of mankind. And when the critics didn't like him, Godzilla has had a loyal fan base from across the world. If anything, it seems that Godzilla is more popular than ever with the release of the 2014 Godzilla movie, of course. So, how did Godzilla become this popular in the first place, and what exactly led to his creation? The year was 1932. The Japanese movie studio known as Toho was formed. Now, for those of you who don't know what Toho Studios is, it's the studio that's responsible for creating and distributing many of the films seen within the Godzilla franchise, along with creating a Japanese superhero TV show, and they also been known to distribute many of the films from Studio Ghibli. But anywho, when Toho Studios first started out, the studio itself was entering a time when the movie industry was changing all around the world. Because during the early 1930s, this was the time when the film industry was in the middle of stepping out of the silent era of filmmaking and entering the world of sound. And although the studio itself was formed in 1932, it made several films, most of them being war movies like The War at Sea from Hawaii to Malay. It wasn't until sometime around World War II, many Japanese movie studios weren't doing so well financially speaking. Toho getting hit the hardest to the point that they were almost bankrupt. To make things even worse for the studio, with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki occurred sometime after that, the Japanese government banned the release of any new war movies in all of Japan. This looks like it was going to be the final nail in the coffin for the studio, since most of the films that they specialized in were primarily war movies. Then one of the members of the studio, Tomonuki Tanaka, decided to take a trip to the United States of America and search for a new idea, since the movie Inaka no Kagi Nai, aka In the Shadow of Glory, was canceled because of political issues. While on his flight back to Japan, Tanaka peered out of the airplane window and gazed towards the dark ocean below, wondering what lay beneath those waves. As soon as he got back to the studio, Tanaka came up with the idea of Gojira, aka Godzilla. In terms of how the idea of Gojira came about, there were several events and elements that came into creating the giant nuclear dinosaur. Two of them being actual real-life events, with the combination of the bombings of Japanese cities such as Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945 during the final stages of World War II, and with the other incident being the Lucky Dragon 5 incident, in which a crew of 23 men on a Japanese tuna fishing boat were exposed and contaminated by nuclear fallout from the United States Castle Bravo thermonuclear device test on Bikini Atoll on March 1st of 1954. Tomoyuki Tanaka figured with the combination of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki along with the Lucky Dragon 5 incident still fresh in the Japanese consciousness, he wanted to create a creature that served as a metaphor for the usage of nuclear weaponry. As far as the other elements that came into play in creating Gojira, remember that trip to America that Tanaka took? Well, it plays an important part in the creation of Gojira because of the movies that came out around that time period. One of them was a re-release of the 1933 movie King Kong, since it was quite the popular movie back in the day. And the other movie was The Beast from 20,000 Phantoms, which was about a giant prehistoric dinosaur called the Rayosaurus, which is released from its frozen hibernated state by an atomic bomb test in the Arctic Circle. So you can see how The Beast from 20,000 Phantoms plays an important role in creating a new generation of creature features. It's basically Godzilla. Without it, I don't think we would have the whole giant monster movie genre as it is. The fact that the movie came out in 1953, a whole year before the release of Gojira, really says something about the influence of The Beast from 20,000 Phantoms. With a new idea for the movie, the film crew at Toho Studios decided to make a script and start film production of Gojira. With the idea of Gojira being the physical embodiment of nuclear weapons, came the task of creating an image to go with it. This is where things took an interesting turn in creating the overall look of Gojira. Even though I said films like King Kong and The Beast from 20,000 Phantoms served as inspirations for Gojira, Tomoyuki Tanaka didn't necessarily have the idea of a giant dinosaur going on a rampage. Instead, he took more the idea of a creature being the result of nuclear testing going on rampage, as opposed to having a dinosaur going on a rampage. And in terms of how King Kong played a role in creating Gojira, Tanaka wanted to have a monster that had a name that was as recognizable as King Kong. And as many people know, the name Gojira itself is a combination of gorilla and kujira, the Japanese word for whale. The overall design of Gojira actually had several ideas that ranged from a creature whose head would have looked like a mushroom to really enforce the whole usage of nuclear weaponry idea, to simply having a design that was just a giant octopus going on a rampage. Although I have a feeling if Toho did stick with the giant octopus idea, the movie itself would have probably been like the Japanese equivalent of It Came From Beneath the Sea, a movie that was also about a giant octopus that was exposed to radiation that goes on a rampage. But anywho, in terms of how Gojira got his iconic design, one of the concept artists took a series of children's books about dinosaurs and decided to combine the features from the following three dinosaurs. The first one being a T-Rex for the overall body structure, the arms of the iguanodon, and finally the plates of a stegosaurus. And after 51 days of filming the movie, Toho Studios finally got Gojira completed and released the film on November 3rd of 1954. And at first, the film, at least the Japanese version, didn't do too well since the film was panned by many Japanese critics, saying that the film was too Hollywoodized and that the idea of the film was too silly to be taken seriously, although the movie was a box office success. Although years later the film would get an Americanized release in 1956, now dubbed Godzilla King of the Monsters, and with the Americanized release of the film, it featured new scenes with American actor Raymond Burr playing the role of Steve Martin, an American reporter who happened to be in Japan while Godzilla goes on a rampage. And much like films like Citizen Kane and The Shining, the 54 movie is now considered to be a masterpiece. And, well, the rest is history. And before I begin my review, is Gojira, along with its Americanized counterpart Godzilla King of Monsters, still hold up after all these years? And as for the plot of, well, actually, before I go any further, I'm going to be giving the plot synopsis to both the Japanese version of the movie and its Americanized counterpart. So I'm going to start with the Japanese version first. As for the plots in the movie, the Japanese are thrown into panic after several ships explode and sink. Soon the Japanese authorities head to Odo Island, where many of the ship disasters have occurred. And while investigating the cause of said disasters, they soon discover the cause of the ship disasters in the form of a giant dinosaur called Gojira. Now, how the monster begins its rampage on Tokyo. Can the monster be destroyed before it's too late? And as for the plot of the Americanized version of the movie, Godzilla King of the Monsters, an American reporter named Steve Martin recalls several events surrounding a giant dinosaur called Godzilla that's responsible for various ship disasters and Tokyo's destruction, while attempting to visit his friend Dr. Zerozawa, who may be hiding a secret. In terms of what I liked about both versions of the movie, I'll start with the Japanese version first, then move on to the Americanized version, but proceeding with the Japanese version first. The soundtrack is done by Akira Ifukube, and the music that he creates for the film is really good. Like, the soundtrack that he did for the film really adds a sense of dread throughout the entire film. Like, most of the soundtrack can make certain scenes range from being either foreboding, sad, and suspenseful during the more darker moments of the film, to being more joyful during the more lighthearted moments of the movie. And the movie moves at a really good pace in the sense of how the movie goes from one scene to another, because the movie never has a dull moment and keeps the viewer engaged from start to finish, regardless if it's Godzilla going on a rampage, the love triangle between Emiko Ogata and Serizawa, to simply having the Japanese reacting to the appearance of Godzilla. Like, every time I watch this, I never get bored because there's always something going on. I also like the fact that the movie isn't a propaganda film, because the movie so easily could have been a propaganda film through one piece of dialogue. That piece of dialogue being in the middle of the movie where Dr. Yamanei talks about Godzilla's origin. He said something along the lines of, how could we have made this horrific monster? Notice how he said we and not Americans. Because when you sit down and think about it, it's really America's fault for creating this horrific creature. And they even explained that, oh, because of the nuclear testing, that's the reason why Godzilla exists. But the fact that they said we and not Americans, I think was a good move on their part. Because on one hand, they so easily could have made the movie a propaganda film if they just said, because of those Americans, we now have to deal with this horrific monster. But they knew better, which is why I think the movie is timeless in that regard. Because if they actually did say something along the lines of, because of those Americans, we have to deal with this horrific monster, I don't think the Japanese version of the movie would be as well loved as it is in today's culture. And in regards to the overall tone of Gojira, the movie itself isn't really a monster movie. If anything, the overall tone of the movie is less of like a science fiction adventure movie and more of a natural disaster drama sort of film. Because unlike something along the lines of The Beast from 20,000 Phantoms or It Came from Beneath the Sea, those movies were typically shown as blockbuster popcorn flicks. Whereas Gojira, on the other hand, is not meant to be a blockbuster flick. It's meant to be more of a drama, because if you notice how the actors and the film crew took the source material seriously, because on one hand, yeah, it's extremely outlandish, but it's the way they present it, because it's not meant to be camping over the top. It's meant to be dark and brooding, and the actors were given this really ridiculous premise, but they played it straight, which is why I think this is considered to be the best of the atomic monster-themed movies of that time period. So you could say that The Beast from 20,000 Phantoms was essentially the Spider-Man of its day, while Gojira was the Dark Knight of its day, in regards to atomic-themed monster movies. And let's talk about Godzilla himself from a special effects standpoint, because the special effects for this movie are both very ambitious for the time and work very well to the film's advantage. Because if you know the production history of what the special effects were originally like for the movie, the studio originally wanted to have Godzilla be depicted using stop motion. However, the studio found out that this would have been extremely costly, and if they did decide to use stop motion, it would have taken them 7 years to complete the film, at least with the special effects. So the studio decided to abandon the idea of stop motion in favor of suitmation, which is the art of having an actor dress in a full body costume, usually to depict an animal or monster for the purpose of performance for a particular movie, aka most of the films seen within the Godzilla franchise. Even this movie ran into some problems, because they actually did make one costume. I forget what they made the costume out of, but the costume was so heavy that the suit actor couldn't physically move within the costume. So they decided to make a new costume made out of a lighter material, but but in the end, the costume itself, much like the first one, was just as difficult to move around in, even though the actor could move maybe an inch or two if they were lucky. So, this is where the special effects team took a more creative direction in bringing Godzilla to life, because they decided to use the second costume, but only used it in parts. Case in point, there are points in time where the actor decided to only wear the lower half of the legs of the costume, and the cinematographers decided to shoot from low camera angles where you only just see the legs, that way you don't see upper half of the costume. And when it came to using the upper half of it, they only just used the upper half without using the lower half, and usually had like small scale miniatures in the foreground, that way you couldn't see the actor's legs. That was a lot easier for the actor to move around and get the specific shots that they needed to get when it came to bringing this character to life. And they used the various shots revolved around Godzilla as well, because on top of having close-ups, they also use tilted angles, regardless if it's looking up at Godzilla or looking down at him, to give the character perspective in terms of how big they are, and use various close-ups to wide shots. That way, it feels like this creature is alive and not just some guy in a lizard costume. And the movie has a variety of other special effects as well. That's not just suitmation. We also have some stop motion used for 2 scenes, which I thought was a nice addition to the movie. Then there are some points in time where they use a puppet for Godzilla's head for extreme close-up shots. Granted, I do have problems with this, but I'll get to that later. And the miniature effects are actually really cool as well, because on top of having Godzilla being depicted using a man suit, they use the small-scale miniatures to really invoke how big Godzilla is in comparison. And the buildings themselves are crafted very well. Like, there's actually a ton of detail to these tiny miniatures that I don't think the average viewer would notice. Because when it comes to watching most of these movies or knowing these movies, most people sit and go, oh, you mean those movies with the bad dubbing, the people wearing rubber lizard costumes, destroying cardboard buildings? And here's the thing, these are not cardboard buildings, they're miniature sets. And as I said earlier, they're nicely designed and have a ton of detail to them. I think it's just yet another cool effect that they use to really bring this character to life. Even a lot of the human characters are very memorable, from some of the minor characters like Shinkichi, if I pronounce his name right, who is essentially a physical allegory for many of the orphans who survived the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then you have the main cast of characters, starting with Emiko, the lead female character of the movie, who is also the daughter of Dr. Yamane, who is essentially the emotional core of the movie, since on top of taking part in a love triangle between Ogata and Zerozawa, she also learns a secret about Zerozawa and is told whether or not she should tell someone about the secret that Dr. Zerozawa told her or withhold the information, adding that much more drama to both the love triangle within the human story, along with adding more consequences by allowing Godzilla to continue going on his rampage. Then you have Dr. Yamane, who, on top of being the father to Emiko, he's also the resident paleontologist within the movie, who essentially wants to study Godzilla. Not to further the studies of paleontology, mind you, but he also believes that by studying Godzilla and not harming him, Godzilla could advance the fields of science. Because on top of having Godzilla be potentially the last of his kind, he also wants to know how a creature like Godzilla could survive nuclear radiation, and essentially wants to capture Godzilla and study him so that he, along with the rest of humanity, can find ways to prevent a creature like Godzilla from ever existing again. Then you have who is potentially the most complex human character of the entire movie, that being Dr. Zerozawa, the man who essentially created the Oxygen Destroyer. And much like Emiko, he too is in an odd situation in regards to the Oxygen Destroyer. Because on one hand, he definitely wants to use the Oxygen Destroyer to benefit society in some regards, but he also fears that because of the destructive power of the Oxygen Destroyer, he believes that by allowing people to know the existence of this device, he fears that many military organizations would want to use this device in the same vein as the atomic bomb. And despite his appearance looking very reminiscent of a stereotypical mad scientist type character, he's not. And has become one of the more memorable human characters of the franchise. Like, to get an idea of how remembered this character is, along with seeing Godzilla and many of his monster co-stars in pop culture parodies, you also see just as many pop culture parodies for a character like Dr. Zerozawa, along with Steve Martin, who I'll get to later, in the same vein. Hell, even Ken Watanabe's character in the 2014 Godzilla movie had the same last name, in reference to this character here. Then you have Ogata, and I will admit, even though he is one of the major players in the movie, and I remember his relationship between Emiko Yamane and Zerozawa, he's definitely one of the weaker aspects of the movie, which I will get to later. Now let's talk about the Americanized version of the movie, Godzilla King of the Monsters. Now, I'm not going to talk too much detail about the Americanized version in regards to the overall production value, since I already talked a great length about the soundtrack, the production values, and the characters a few minutes ago, but I'm going to talk about what made the Americanized version of the movie different from its Japanese counterpart. And essentially, the big thing that makes Godzilla King of the Monsters different from its Japanese counterpart is the inclusion of an American character known as Steve Martin, who was played by Raymond Burr. And if you're wondering as to why the Americanized version is edited the way it is with the Raymond Burr character, it made sense from a business standpoint, because what would make more sense? Showing the Japanese movie to an American audience that has no understanding of the culture nor the actors involved, or showing a Japanese product with the addition of an American actor that people are familiar with experiencing said culture and actors involved with the movie. So essentially, the Steve Martin character is meant to serve as the audience's eyes and ears for the Americanized cut of the movie. And the reason as to why the inclusion of the Steve Martin character works for the Americanized version of the movie is primarily because Steve Martin is relevant to the story, because sometime after this, many other giant Japanese monster movies get Americanized releases as well, but the problem was anytime those movies included American actors, they were there to primarily deposit exposition and weren't really relevant to the overall story. Steve Martin, on the other hand, he's not there to deposit exposition. He's actually there to visit a friend and happens to be a part of the journey for many of the other characters in terms of figuring out what's causing the shipwrecks to witnessing Godzilla going on a rampage. Also, Godzilla King of the Monsters is a pretty significant entry within the Godzilla franchise itself, because whereas the 1954 movie was considered a flop in Japan, with the Americanized version in America, it was considered a box office hit, which means if it wasn't for this particular version of the movie, then Godzilla would never have become as popular in the West as he is today. I also like the way they integrate Steve Martin in the context of the story in terms of how he interacts off several of the characters. Case in point, when he's talking to his friend Dr. Zerozawa, even though the two actors aren't on screen together, they edit in a way where you get a sense that they're talking to each other, because they're both talking on phones, so it made sense for them not to be in the same area. But the thing that stood out to me the most is kind of near the end of the movie, where you have Emiko talking to Steve Martin, and the way they shot this, they incorporate most of the footage from the Japanese version, but then they have a scene where you have a person who's dressed up like Emiko, but it's not the actual actress because they shoot it from behind, to really make the scene more concrete and flow better, to give the viewer that, oh, Steve Martin is really talking to this person, even though the actual actress herself is not there. In terms of what I disliked about the movie, I'm going to start with the Japanese version first, then talk about the Americanized version. And honestly, the first two problems I have with the movie are more nitpicks. The first of them being the editing for one scene. The scene in question being the part of the movie where you see a salvage crew who end up finding survivors from one of the other ship disasters. The movie, at this particular moment, does these Star Wars prequel style wipes for 3 edits, and why this bugs me is for the fact that this is the only time in the entire movie where that particular style of edit is used, because for the rest of the movie it uses various other style of movie edits, from match cuts, jump cuts to cross dissolves, and the editors could have easily just used a cross dissolve for that one sequence, and this happens in both cuts of the movie as well. Another nitpick that I have is more to do with the DVD version of the Japanese version that I have. From time to time, the subtitles go by just a bit too fast for me to read. Other than those few moments, the subtitles are pretty good. In terms of the actual problems that I have with the movie, let's start with the Godzilla head that Toho used for various close-up shots of Godzilla. I think that the puppet head they used for those close-ups looks terrible, because when you look at the head on the Godzilla costume, there's no doubt that that is Godzilla. Yet anytime they cut to a close-up of Godzilla's head using the puppet, it looks nothing like the head that you see on the costume, and I kind of snicker occasionally every time I see a close-up of the puppet, because all I can sit there and think about is, that's not Godzilla, that's a Muppet that got exposed to gamma radiation. Another problem that I have with the movie is the Ogata character, since I think he really adds nothing to the overall story outside of being a part of the love triangle, and I think that out of any element seen within this film, he is the weakest part of the entire movie. Although the actor playing Ogata does bring a lot of charisma to the role. I also question the logic behind Dr. Yamane during certain sequences. The two that come to mind is the scene involving him and several colleagues investigating an area of Odo Island that Godzilla attacked the night before, and he sees that everyone around him is wearing hazmat suits with Geiger counters, and he knows that the air is contaminated by radiation. What does he do? He proceeds to investigate the area that he knows is contaminated and finds a trilobite that's radioactive and proceeds to pick it up. And this leads to one of the other characters going, you really shouldn't be picking that up without protection. Now, granted, I can kind of understand that maybe back then the whole concept of radiation was new to a lot of people, but I feel that at that particular moment in time, he should have known better or be like, hey, someone with actual protection, I found a trilobite. And another scene that comes to mind is sometime after Godzilla's first appearance in film, there's a scene where he is giving exposition on what Godzilla is exactly to both the people around him and to the viewer. He states that Godzilla came from the Jurassic era, in which he states was over 2 million years ago. And the problem that I have with this is, here's this one character who is supposed to be a renowned paleontologist, and yet he gets some facts wrong, because if you actually know your paleontology, you would actually know that the Jurassic era was 452 million years ago, and not 2 million years ago. Now, onto the problems of the Americanized version of the movie. I really don't like the way the movie begins, because it uses one of those plot devices of having the movie begin at the end of the story and proceed with a person within the story recalling events which leads up to the rest of the movie in the form of a flashback. I really don't like this style of storytelling because it tells the viewer what's going to happen ahead of time and make the big moments not as impactful. And if you've been paying attention to this channel for some time, you would know that I'm not the biggest fan of this particular type of framing device for a movie. Also, there are certain scenes that are taken out of context. For example, the love triangle, because in the Japanese version, the love triangle is basically the centerpiece of the human aspect of the story, while in the Americanized version, it's in the background for most of the movie, since Raymond Burr's character was the main star of that version of the movie. Also, the love triangle itself is handled differently here, because in the Japanese version, Dr. Zerozawa is fully aware of the relationship between Emiko and Ogata, while in the Americanized version, he is completely unaware of the relationship between Emiko and Ogata. Also, Dr. Zerozawa really doesn't have that much screen time in this version of the movie. And what bugs me about this is, he's basically the main reason for Steve Martin to go to Japan in the first place. And he's supposed to be like a big character, but again, because he has so little screen time, that we really don't get a sense of what he's like. And another aspect that bugs me about the relationship between Steve Martin and Dr. Zerozawa is, throughout the movie, Steve Martin claims to be a really good friend of Dr. Zerozawa, but we really don't get a sense of what their friendship is really like outside of that one phone call they have throughout the entire movie. Like, I was expecting points of time where maybe you would have seen him talking to Dr. Zerozawa a bit more as the movie progressed or something. Also, the American version of the movie is a lot shorter in comparison to its Japanese counterpart. Like, to give an example of how different the runtime is between the two movies, the original Japanese movie, Gojira, is 96 minutes in length, while Godzilla King of the Monsters runtime is 80 minutes in length, which means that they had to cut out a lot of the more intense scenes for the American cut of the movie. And this includes re-editing the entire ending, which really bugs me. Because with the Japanese version of the movie, it ends with Dr. Yamane saying a quote that's among the lines of, "If we continue to misuse atomic weaponry, maybe we'll see another Godzilla." And with that end ending of the movie, it's meant to serve as a warning about the misusage of nuclear weapons, essentially giving a movie a bittersweet ending, while in the American version of the movie, it ends with a more happier ending with Raymond Burr's character saying, "It's over, we can start anew," which really butchers the overall message of the movie in that regard. Like, why exclude Dr. Yamane's warning about the misusage of nuclear weapons? Perhaps it was edited that way in order to satisfy American audiences, since Americans were already adjusted to that lifestyle started by the atomic age, unlike the Japanese. Although the more likely outcome probably came from the fact that this was made around the 50s, and Hollywood had this kind of set of rules where any movie that came into America had to end with a happy ending. Also, the American version of the movie has no idea how Godzilla is supposed to be in regards to size. The big example being how they determine how big he is. Because with the Japanese version, they state that he's 50 meters tall, which is roughly 164 feet tall, while in the American version, they state that he's 400 feet tall. Why is he that big? Was that a translation error, or did the Americans purposely make him that big to make him more threatening? We just don't know. Then you got the scenes with Steve Martin reporting Godzilla that just don't add up. For example, during Godzilla's rampage, Steve Martin is given a report, and the way the scene is shot shows us that he's looking down on Godzilla. So we're led to assume that Steve Martin is watching from a tall building, yet when Godzilla arrives to the location that Steve Martin is given a report at, he suddenly looks up at Godzilla as he's attacking the building. Why is he looking up if he was looking down at Godzilla earlier? Did the building that Steve Martin was hiding out in suddenly shrink in size, or did Godzilla get bigger? So, for my final verdict of Gojira along with Godzilla King of the Monsters, the movie isn't just another monster or loose movie. It's a true classic that stands above many other science fiction movies from the time, and a great movie to begin a long and successful, in some cases, franchise focused on everyone's favorite radioactive dinosaur, Godzilla. Granted, I don't think the Americanized version, Godzilla King of the Monsters, is as good as Gojira, but I think it's still a good movie in its own way. Overall, Gojira is one of the best and most important monster movies ever made. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about both Gojira along with its Americanized counterpart, Godzilla, King of the Monsters? So, looks like both Gojira, along with its Americanized counterpart, Godzilla King of the Monsters, both got really good reception, which isn't a surprise. So, for my final rating of Gojira, I give it a 5 out of 5. And as for Godzilla King of the Monsters, I give it a 4 out of 5. So, considering the fact that this is my overall 100th episode, do you think I picked the perfect movie to celebrate my huge milestone? If so, comment below, and see you later.